What makes you stand out and what make your ideas different?
And it's Jeremy to answer that first.
Well, I was never a great adherent to New Labour. I'll let you know that secretly. Secretly within this audience here today. I entered this contest at the behest of others because I wanted the opportunity to have the discussion, to have the debate, and party members to have a chance to discuss the economic, social, international direction this party takes. The priority of a Labour government should be to reduce and remove the ghastly inequality that exists within our society. Why do the top 100 families own the equivalent of 30% of the wealth of the entire population? Set ourselves the task of eliminating poverty and inequality in Britain by investing in public services, investing in growth industries, investing in a sustainable economy. That seems to me a much better way forward than accepting the narrative of austerity. That's why I'll be on the march this afternoon.
Britain historically, in the last 100 years at least, had always been between democratic socialism and economic conservatism. Tony Blair and New Labour said that because they had managed to meld those two, that was why they won.
I think my generation is trying to get to a different type of politics, which is rooted in strong values and convictions, but it's not quite left and right in the way that it's been before.
He managed to get the Labour Party back into power with a big kind of landslide. In 1987, the Conservatives were so unpopular that almost anything Labour did meant that they would have won. Over and over again, we were told that Tony Blair and New Labour had won because they invented the third way.
I've always understood, because of Dad, why some people who'd done very well, who'd come up in life and made it on their own, felt the Tory party was the party that was for them because it was the party of ambition and aspiration.
Right.
And that the Labour Party somehow wasn't. And I think, to an extent, I mean, that's what the Labour Party became. It became too stuck in the past, too rooted in saying, well, that's where you are, that's where you stay. Whereas I think today the position's changed around. What I've always wanted with today's Labour Party is to be the party of aspiration, but say, you know, you can have a society where there's ambition without a lack of compassion. And
yeah, because I was going to say, so why aren't you a Tory?
Because I think that in the end, you actually fulfil your ambition. I think you fulfil your ambitions better in a society where people have some sense of duty towards other people.
Labour promised a new kind of inclusive society. They promised every kind of family would have more opportunities. They promised that schools would be better funded. And I suppose that in Britain, the state religion is the National Health Service. And under the Conservatives, it had experienced a lot of cuts.
We will cut National Health Service waiting lists, treating an extra 100,000 patients as a first step by scrapping the internal market and using the first £100 million wasted on NHS red tape.
Rather than simply putting money into the NHS, they came up with private finance initiatives for, things like the railway, for schools, for the NHS. And that meant that rather than funding them directly, the money went into a form of outsourcing. Initially meant that the government weren't spending as much money because, private finance put some money in themselves. But in the long term meant that it cost a lot more. It also meant that for the private finance side that were investing in schools, hospitals, etc., and given the government contracts, there was no kind of capital risk involved. So if it failed, the government shouldered all of the financial burden. The companies never did. There was a lot of hope at the beginning, and then by the end, the Labour Party had essentially thrown themselves back into the wilderness through a couple of errors. We saw the introduction of tuition fees for college, which was, again, massively unpopular. And then deciding to go to war with Iraq was incredibly unpopular. Obviously, there were huge protests in the street.
There are 600 and more demonstrations in cities all around the world. Every country, every continent, everybody in the world has a chance today to say no, absolutely no, to war on Iraq. This movement is giving that message to the British government. Stop now or pay a political price.
Slowly but surely, after Iraq and tuition fees, the shine really came off New Labour.
I may have been wrong. That's your call.
But believe one thing, if nothing else. I did what I thought was right for our country. And I came into office with high hopes for Britain's future. And you know, I leave it with even higher hopes for Britain's future.
Gordon Brown very briefly followed Tony Blair. He was a huge part of his government. The two of them essentially were New Labour. In their tenure, the global financial crash happened. Essentially, New Labour were discredited. They were seen as not being particularly good with money. The Conservatives were able to say that their form of socialism had failed and the only way forward was austerity and economic conservatism.
We leave no apology, no regret, no comfort, and not an ounce of contrition. We leave you years of painful and difficult decisions. This is our legacy to you.
By the time it got to 2010, the Conservatives were able to get in with essentially a minority government. Once Gordon Brown stood down, whoever took over from him as leader was, very, very key. Of the 6 people who battled to be leader, Ed Miliband was probably one of the most left-wing. And all that Ed Miliband essentially did was carry on from where Gordon Brown had left off.
The most important lesson of New Labour is this. Every time we made progress, we did it by challenging the conventional wisdom. Think of how we took on the idea there was a public ownership solution to every problem our society faced. We changed Clause 4, we were right to do so. Think of how we challenged the impression that we taxed for its own sake and we were hostile to business. We were right to change.
During this kind of, relatively far-right government that were cutting public spending massively, that were cutting benefits to disabled people, to single mothers, levels of poverty kind of soar in the UK. At that point, Labour could have said, we need to stop this, poverty should be eradicated. Austerity is a completely debunked economic idea. It doesn't help the economy. The only way forward is to make sure that you stop suffering, invest in things, create economic stimulus. But instead, what Labour under Ed Miliband said was we would do exactly what the Conservatives did, but slower or slightly less. So it didn't seem like a particularly left-wing Labour Party. And as a result, when Labour should have won because the Conservatives were so unpopular, Labour lost and the Conservatives came back with an increased majority. And that meant that, when Ed Miliband resigned, when it came to the next stage, a lot of people were really, really fed up with the Labour Party anyway. Every time there was a leadership election, the Labour left would try and put forward a candidate. They would normally fail to get the requisite number of nominations from members of Parliament. But this time, the people on the left in the Labour Party really, really fought and said, look, just let us on the ballot. And that way, you can keep us quiet. We can see how few people want us. But it's good to have a broad, open competition instead of just a couple of people on the right.
Let's be proud of putting forward an economic strategy that is about redistribution of wealth, that is about eliminating poverty, that is about giving everybody real opportunities in life. Thank you.
So Jeremy Corbyn managed to squeak onto the ballot at the very last minute. Everybody in the media and in Parliament in Labour assumed that he wouldn't get any further. But the key point was essentially when, while the leadership election was going on, there was a vote on benefit cuts. So the Conservatives, with their new majority, had put forward a bill on benefit cuts that would have seen even more cuts to the poorest people. Labour were told, all of the Labour MPs were told by the interim leader, Harriet Harman, to abstain on the vote. Jeremy Corbyn and a number of people on the Labour left broke the whip and voted against the bill.
We had all this anti-benefit narrative, as though there's nobody sleeping on the streets of Britain, as though the number of children growing up in desperate poverty isn't increasing day after day, as though the number of young people unable to do homework because their bedrooms are too crowded by their siblings, and all the other issues. Please.
I'm pretty certain Jeremy Corbyn was the only leadership candidate who did vote against the benefit cuts. And after that, it was essentially a big sea change. People were genuinely shocked that there was this huge appetite amongst people, especially young people, especially working class people, for somebody who would stand up against benefit cuts and who would actually move away from the kind of new Labour business as usual idea towards, more traditional democratic socialism. nationalisation, proper funding, away from private finance initiatives, looking at free education and being very anti-war.
It's the Conservative Party's failure on Brexit and its lurch to the hard right that has provoked the crisis our country faces this autumn. After failing to negotiate a Brexit deal that would protect jobs and living standards, Boris Johnson's Tories are driving the country towards a no-deal cliff edge. Let's be very clear. We will do everything necessary to stop a disastrous no deal for which this government has no mandate. We will work together with MPs from across Parliament to pull our country back from the brink. And I will bring a vote of no confidence in the government. And if we're successful, would seek to form a time-limited caretaker administration to avert no deal and call an immediate general election so the people can decide our country's future. While Brexit is the framework of the crisis we face, the problems facing our country run much, much deeper. A general election triggered by the Tory Brexit crisis will be a crossroads for our country. It will be a once-in-a-generation chance for a real change of direction, potentially on the scale of 1945. Things cannot go on as they were before. The Conservatives and a very wealthy establishment that they so happily represent have failed our country. Labour offers a real change of direction that I believe the country needs. A radical programme, and I'm proud it's a radical programme, to rebuild and transform. This is an historic moment with the potential for real change to transform our country if we grasp that opportunity. Thank you.